question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr David Clark.
Mr Speaker, Labor will be supporting this bill with some reservations, and I want to echo the Minister's sentiment in thanking the committee for the constructive work it did. Certainly my observation was that around the table there was a spirit of wanting to make this legislation as fair as it could be. And the Minister raised the issue of fairness many times and talked about how our tax system was good because it had fair obligations. And then she helpfully linked this to compliance, all of which are issues that I would like to cover in my contribution. It certainly has historically been the case that we've had good voluntary compliance in New Zealand, but what the Minister didn't point to was the fact that that compliance is dropping. That voluntary compliance that we rely on in our tax system is dropping. And that is inevitably in part because businesses are struggling under this government. We know there's 2,500 fewer small businesses being created every year under this government. It's in part because people are struggling, and we know that inequalities are the highest they have ever been in New Zealand in recorded history under this government. And we also know that people who can't afford to put food on the table are going to struggle to meet their child support obligations and other tax burdens that are upon them. And this government is doing very little to help those people. Those record figures for inequality are something that should be regarded as a national shame. We have a history and a pride in being a country of fairness and equity, and that reputation is going down the tubes. And so the contribution made on behalf of the Minister by Minister Goodhue begged a question about whether these changes and future changes that the government wants to make will contribute towards that understanding of our tax system as fair and equitable, and will contribute toward the voluntary compliance that we actually rely on in order to have a functioning and efficient tax system that collects revenue to fund our schools and hospitals, which I'm sure most members across the House would want to see continue. We heard yesterday in the financial review hearings about the fact that the IRD are not meeting their new target, their new revised target of answering 3 out of 4 phone calls, which I found shocking, frankly. That 3 out of 4 phone calls is the target in the first place is pretty shocking, and that the department is not meeting that target is, I think, unacceptable. And that points again to the kinds of frustrations that people are experiencing with the tax department, which is under-resourced and is struggling with an outdated computer system. We worry on this side of the House that these proposed changes might come back to the House for revision when the government tries to implement them. That has certainly happened before with legislation in my time here, that it has been passed through this House and come back for revision because the department has found that it's not able to implement it. The Minister opposite raises the 9 years that we were in government, and that's an interesting point because when this government came in 5 long years ago, it was in the briefing for the incoming minister that this problem of the computer system urgently needed addressing. And in fact, her Prime Minister acknowledged that changes to our tax system were being held back 2 years ago now because the system hadn't been repaired. And I'm very glad that the Minister is bringing this up because that problem is growing. It is a shocking problem that needs to be addressed, and taxpayer money is being spent on it with very, very, very little progress. We heard yesterday in the Select Committee, Ms Tolley, that $50 million has been spent so far on the computer system, and what do we have out of it so far? We have out of it, unfortunately, an agreement from ministers that it should proceed in theory. We have an in-principle agreement to make some change. $50 million. Yep, $50 million, and now we have an in-principle agreement to make the change that the Inland Revenue Department recommended to this government 5 years ago, and the Prime Minister acknowledged 2 years ago was urgent. $50 million spent, now we have an in-principle agreement to do something about it. That is why on this side of the House we are worried whether this legislation can actually be implemented by this government. They have been making excuses. They are getting nowhere with fixing the tax system, and New Zealand is suffering because every Western democracy needs an effective and efficient tax system to collect the taxes so that we can have schools and hospitals. It won't do to just flog off every asset that the government owns. Eventually we run out of assets to flog off to fund those kinds of projects, and we've seen that the government's no good at doing that anyway. It's failed to meet its target. We do need a reliable tax system that collects the revenue fairly, as the Minister indicated at the start, and we need voluntary compliance, which involves having the people out there getting a satisfying experience with the tax system as they hand over their dues voluntarily, not one that faces 3 out of 4 phone calls unanswered, and a tax system that releases information willy-nilly as well. We had the privacy breaches widely reported last year with the IRD tax system. Last year it was reported that over 6,000 people's details were released by the IRD, their most private details, because that tax system is burdened and is squeaking at the seams. And you'd expect that. It's 21 years old, for goodness sake. Not many people rely on 21-year-old computer systems in their everyday work. 10 years before Facebook, for goodness sake. And that is an outrage. It needs to be updated. The $50 million spent so far to get an in-principle agreement to proceed ought to lead us somewhere. And in fact, we also learned in the Select Committee yesterday that the tenders for the development of the business case, which is the next stage, for the first stage of the business case, are out at the moment, and they will be reporting back in June next year with an updated business case. June next year. There's some hope. They will get there eventually. They'll have an in-principle agreement, then they'll have an in-principle business case. Mr Dunn may well be back as Minister of Revenue by then. I'm sure he's got nothing to fear and nothing to hide, or that's what he'll be claiming. Goodness knows, this government does not seem focused on that task. They're not resourcing it, and so that's why we've got these worries about whether these actual measures will be able to be implemented. There is one equity issue that remains important with this legislation, and that is with the foreign superannuation changes. If we take, for example, two young New Zealanders who go on their overseas exchange, then one of them heads off to England and one of them heads off to Australia, they will find, if they are saving there in a foreign super scheme, that when they return to New Zealand, one of them will have a whopping great tax bill and the other one will not. And at some level that does not feel very comfortable at all. And the problem, quite simply, would not arise if we had a proper capital gains tax in this country. A proper capital gains tax is something, again, this government has been avoiding because they are very interested in protecting the interests of those who have money and their interests above fairness, Mr Speaker. And that's why the voluntary compliance level is dropping, in my view. People do no longer regard the system as being as fair as it was once upon a time, and nor is it easy to interact with. And with the privacy breach concerns on top of that, we have a department that's struggling, that the government clearly is not focused on and clearly is not interested in, and we have growing non-compliance. And part of that non-compliance, as I mentioned, is due to tax avoidance, which others see as unfair, and then they feel they should not themselves be paying their burden. And we know this is a growing problem worldwide. A recent edition of The Economist reported that now very close on 200,000 individuals have assets of 30 million or more, and that's a 6% increase on last year. There is a growing inequality of wealth around the world. The problem in New Zealand is growing faster than elsewhere, and that level of inequality is driving the non-compliance, as I explained at the beginning of my address. And unfortunately, this department is not even able to be focused very much on pulling that in. There's no estimate, we heard in Select Committee yesterday, of the size of avoidance in New Zealand, and the department finds it's too hard and they don't have the resources available to them to actually estimate that properly. So here we have another bill going through that we will be supporting because it makes some steps in the right direction, certainly with the tax on mining. We agree that some of those things that have been clarified in the Select Committee needed clarification. There's sensible changes, and the committee was well chaired and worked through the issues thoroughly. I congratulate Mr Goldsmith on his work in that regard. We have made some good changes here, the equity issues with those coming from Australia as opposed to the rest of the world still stand out as unusual and difficult, and I'm sure that we'll hear many people out there listening who have concerns about that.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member.
And therefore
his
we'll
time has
support. Well,
expired.
thank you, Mr. Chair.
I call Paul